this, gastric emptying is accelerated, and this results in higher blood glucose levels. And remember, these are healthy subjects, so you've got a difference in blood of 1 to 2 millimoles per litre in the blood glucose response. That's a lot. So modest difference in gastric emptying, relatively big difference in blood glucose. Furthermore, a major mechanism regulating pyloric pressures and gastric emptying is feedback from the intestine, and this feedback is blocked by giving exendin, so it explains the more rapid gastric emptying. Now, what happens if you give exogenous GLP? And these are clearly pharmacological doses, but low and high. And we're measuring gastric emptying of a mixed solid liquid meal in healthy subjects. Well, you delay gastric emptying profoundly, both solids and liquids. The extent of that delay is sufficient to cause gastroparesis in half the patients. They're not sick. It just delays gastric emptying profoundly, both solids and liquids. And what do we see with GLP-1? Both doses lower the blood glucose. And these are healthy subjects, so they lower it quite a lot, close to 2 millimoles per litre. But what do you see with insulin? Rather than the insulin levels be higher with GLP-1, they're lower. Okay? So the lowering of glucose is associated with a reduction in insulin postprandially. And furthermore, you can account for the reduction in blood glucose by the effects on gastric emptying. If gastric emptying is slowed more, the reduction in blood glucose is greater. A study again from Michael Naut's group and Uris Meyer showing that if you give erythromycin, it's known to accelerate gastric emptying. So GLP-1 slows gastric emptying, erythromycin normalises that. And if you give erythromycin, there's the blip in blood glucose. So erythromycin antagonises the effects of GLP-1 to flatten the blood glucose profile. So it's all pretty conclusive. So endogenous GLP-1 slows gastric emptying and glucose absorption, and a reduction in postprandial glycemia by exogenous GLP-1 is related to slowing of gastric emptying. And so GLP-1 may not be a true incretin in Creutzfeldt's word, and that inhibition of gastric emptying appears to outweigh its direct insulinotropic effects, at least acutely. So does GLP-1 have other properties of native GLP-1? Because all of this has now been translated into the clinical domain, which I'll only talk about very briefly. So it may influence beta cell function and mass, and it increases beta cell insulin production, animals and humans, increases beta cell responsiveness to glucose, and may inhibit beta cell loss. And we've got lots of beautiful pictures of animal, but we're still striving to find this data in humans. Finding differences in HOMA B in studies with liraglutide does not prove that you've improved the amount of beta cells. But it well may do that, and if it does it, it'll clearly be a major shift in the management of diabetes. GLP-1, again, in pharmacological doses, certainly inhibits energy intake acutely. This is not due to the induction of nausea, and it's associated with weight loss. This is the Lancet study, 2 to 4 kilograms per se, which is again not due to the induction of nausea. So we have this situation of GLP-1 with diverse effects to stimulate insulin secretion, inhibit glucagon, slow gastric emptying markedly, a very important effect. I didn't show effects on hepatic glucose production, inhibiting appetite and possibly affecting beta cell proliferation. And we all know that native GLP-1 is rapidly degraded by DPP-4. And this is where we have the translation to the clinical arena, which is the last part of the talk, and I won't dwell on this, but it comes up in many other parts of this meeting. So we either have incretin mimetics or we have DPP-4 inhibitors. And I just want to talk about some of these concepts because what's emerged is predictable by the physiology of native GLP-1. So it's a short half-life, and if you have a DPP-4 inhibitor, you increase it. And DP4 inhibitors also will, of course, affect GIP, and there are a number of them. This is 4, but it's a very long list of at least 8 currently. And they have different binding characteristics, and each manufacturer tries to tell you theirs is better than the next. But for practical purposes, I don't see any differences. Now, this happens to be vildagliptin, showing that it increases the GLP-1 response to a meal. But the magnitude of this effect does not come close to what you see with exogenous GLP-1 in pharmacological doses. So you're not necessarily expecting effects on gastric emptying, you're not necessarily expecting effects on appetite. If we look at the effects of vildagliptin, you find it stimulates insulin, it lowers blood glucose modestly, and it also reduces glucagon. And that was not predictable because you had stimulation of GLP-1, but also stimulation of GIP, which will favour an increase in glucagon. And this is one of our studies showing, as a group, these drugs don't affect gastric emptying. If they do, it's very modest. So it's quite different to exogenous GLP-1. And there's a logical combination with metformin, whichever the DP4 inhibitor, because metformin per se raises GLP-1, as said in this slide, possibly through increasing GLP-1 synthesis, certainly not by DP4 inhibition, because it doesn't increase GIP. And in fact, the most likely mechanism is by effects on bile acids, is my thoughts, bile acid transporters. So it's a logical combination. And this happens to be sitagliptin, but it doesn't matter which one. When you add up to metformin, you get quite profound glucose lowering. So it's an ideal combination. And of course, because the effects of GLP-1 are glucose dependent, you're not expecting hypoglycemia unless you combine it with insulin or sulfonylurea, and that is what the clinical programs of all of these drugs have shown us. And furthermore, DPP4 inhibitors are not associated with either weight loss or weight gain as a group, because only the modest elevation in GLP-1. Now, of course, with all the DP4 inhibitors, the effects are going to depend on what you eat. And none of the manufacturers have looked at it. I mean, are you having meals with fat or carbohydrate or protein? Because all this will profoundly affect your GLP-1 response. The GLP-1 analogues, again, is another development, and it's very much more linked to pharmacological GLP-1. And the first was, of course, exenatide, and there are now a number of these. And this was, again, completely fortuitous. Who would have thought that a lizard would lead to a major compound in the area? And it's the Gila monster and the saliva of the Gila monster, where exendin 4 has about a 50% homology to native GLP-1. And I don't know how this was discovered. Apparently the Gila monster only eats about 5 times a year, but you don't want to be near it when that happens. And it's an extraordinary observation, and this became our first drug. 2005, this is what we got. And again, I'm not talking specifically about exenatide. This is what you'd expect with any GLP-1 agonist causing pharmacological GLP-1 concentrations, as well as the lowering of glycated hemoglobin. It results in this weight loss of about 4 kilograms or so. But it's interesting, this important comparative study in Annals of Internal Medicine from Robert Heine found equivalent effects of exenatide and glargine. I think all of you will know that data, but quite different effects, with the glargine lowering fasting glucose much more and having lesser effect on postprandial blood glucose. Now, that's not explicable by insulin stimulation or glucagon suppression. It's explicable by the fact that exenatide profoundly slows gastric emptying. And it's quite variable effect, and the manufacturers have tried to ignore this, but it can profoundly delay gastric emptying, this after reasonably chronic administration, and that slowing of gastric emptying largely accounts for the lowering of blood glucose. Now that's with exenatide. Now, of course, there's now long-acting release technology which has been applied to exendin, just refused by the FDA, but there's evidence this may have greater efficacy than the standard BD preparation. And again, the industry's refused to look at effects on gastric emptying by decent techniques. but this has looked at the absorption of paracetamol, and it seems to be slowed at baseline and at week 14 by the exenatide BD, but there's much less difference with the exenatide once a week. Now, I was talking to someone, again, I think at the lunch break, there's no excuse not to measure gastric emptying properly now because you can get stable isotope breath tests. You don't have to have radionuclide techniques and a gamma camera, and paracetamol absorption should not be used for that purpose. So an unresolved issue is whether there's tachyphylaxis to the effect of GLP-1 on gastric emptying, and whether that tachyphylaxis occurs if you have sustained receptor exposure to GLP-1. So the manufacturers of exenatide BD have to say that occurs. Novo with liraglutide would like to say that's the initial effect and then disappears, but they don't know. The thiazolidines have got worse since this slide, but of course they're expensive. They don't have particular issues of hypoglycemia, but they do cause weight gain, and they're a major issue with cardiovascular safety in the case of rosiglitazone. And insulin, of course, is still relatively expensive and lowers the blood glucose. Hypoglycemia is a major issue, as is weight gain. And the DPP-4 inhibitor, early days, they're relatively expensive. They don't cause hypoglycemia, they're weight neutral, and we don't know about cardiovascular safety with them. And then we come to the incretin mimetics, and I don't think it matters which one probably. Again, they're expensive. They probably do have a durable action. They don't cause hypoglycemia unless you combine them with a sulfonylurea or insulin. I don't see why you would. And they cause significant weight loss. They do have adverse effects, but this is not usually an issue with prolonged use. So we have this scoring, and at the end of that scoring you can argue about it, but the DPP-4 inhibitors and the incretin mimetic do very well. So this is David Nathan's nomogram in the New England Journal of Medicine, and Michael has put a big cross through it and suggested adding incretin-based medications. And cost, of course, is a major consideration, but if you take that aside, I believe he's correct. Now, I'm going to stop at that point. So again, I've told you a story, 1902 to 2010, and I wouldn't have predicted this. This Yogi Berra was an American baseball coach, and he was known for his so-called malapropisms, and he suggested that prediction is very hard, especially when it's about the future. But when you look at confusing things in research, I always look at Alice in Wonderland. I don't know how much Alice in Wonderland has looked at in the Asian region. And this is a conversation between Alice and the Cheshire Cat. And I think it applies to research endeavour in general and predictability. And he said, "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" "That depends a good deal on where you want to go," said the cat. "I don't much care where," said Alice. "Then it doesn't matter which way you go," said the cat. "So long as I get somewhere," Alice added as an explanation. "Are you sure to do that," said the cat, "if you only walk long enough?" So we've been walking from 1902 to 2005, and we did get somewhere. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Horowitz. Very comprehensive, and practical, and also exciting talk. We have 5 minutes, so now time for the comments and questions. Are there any comments or questions? Dr. Horowitz, I have one question. So you talked about action of incretin, but how about the regulation of incretin itself? How is GLP-1, for example, GLP-1 regulated regarding the secretion?
Whether the GLP-1 response can be restored. Well, the answer is who knows, but I'm sure there's studies in progress. There are a couple of papers from, again, Holt's group, looking at type 2 patients with improvement in glycemic control and showing some improvement in their GIP response to as far as insulin stimulation. So it's inconclusive, and the question is, if it's restored, what is the time course? Nevertheless, I think it's clear it's not an irreversible phenomenon which was thought in the past.
So, but are there any feedback mechanisms? Because in the aspect of endocrinology, hormone usually regulate by feedback mechanism.
Yes.
Which one is regulate GLP-1, and are there any feedback circuit?
How is GLP-1
yes.
regulated? Well, again, as far as the triggering for GLP-1, it's really not understood. I showed some molecular studies, but again, that was just dealing with glucose, where we know fat is a secretagogue, we know bile acid is a very potent secretagogue. So, I mean, there's studies going on using bile acids or inhibitors of bile uptake to stimulate incretin secretion. So it's going to be certainly multifactorial. It's not just going to be one receptor.
Okay, thank you. Oh, please.
Lustig, San Francisco. Over here. The pharmacodynamic profile of GLP-1 is extraordinarily close to that which is seen from stimulation of the vagus nerve, other than the intestinal transit time,
Yeah.
which in fact they're opposite. But other than that, in terms of insulinotropic action, in terms of glucose disposal, etc. In addition, we know that vagal efferents stimulate the L cells of the distal ileum. So what I'm asking is, how much of the GLP-1 effect is actually vagally mediated? If you cut the vagus nerve, does GLP-1 go down? And then the second question is, you showed data showing duodenal administration of calories. What if those were gastric administration of calories? Would the effect be any different because you'd be now utilizing the vagus nerve?
They're two very good questions. I probably don't have very good answers. As far as the vagus, I think it's still believed the effects on appetite are largely vagally mediated, but of course you haven't done that in humans. Now, if you go to the diabetic situation, I've got to talk tomorrow, the damage to the nervous system is far more than just external vagus, it's also the intrinsic nervous system. Michael Camilleri's got a paper giving exogenous GLP-1 to diabetics with autonomic neuropathy, meaning cardiovascular autonomic neuropathy, and showing that the relaxation of the proximal stomach doesn't occur in that group. On the other hand, in the paper I showed you with exenatide slowing gastric emptying, the baseline rate of gastric emptying meant if it was more delayed, they got less of a response, but they still got a response. So I think it's not going to be just the vagus, but we don't know, and we don't have very good tests of vagal function in humans. We're using indirect tests of GI autonomic neuropathy for the main part. Again, what I think is very important with the issue of intragastric administration, because the answer is we don't know. We certainly know that the gastric emptying is reproducible in a given individual, but we ourselves were planning to do studies in that area, but now there's no excuse for just giving someone a meal and saying we're measuring gastric emptying by paracetamol and it's a crude index, and because this is clearly a possible major modifier of the incretin response. So they just need to do a stable isotope technique or an ultrasound technique to actually look at the answer, because apart from about 15 papers, the whole incretin literature of giving nutrients orally has not quantified the rate of delivery of the nutrient from the stomach into the small intestine. And the implication we have is clear, it's just glucose, we don't know fat or other carbohydrate, is a critical determinant of the incretin response. So there are two vague answers, I'm sorry.
Are there any comments or questions? I have another last question. In terms of the energy metabolism, is GLP-1 is a catabolic or anabolic hormone?
As far as energy, well, there is weak data suggests, again, animal data suggests that GLP-1 may increase resting energy expenditure. Uh-huh. That's certainly being pushed by Novo in relation to the raglutide, and that's not an area of my primary expertise, but I see the data as pretty weak.
Uh-huh. Okay, thank you. Oh, please.
Well, again, GLP-1 analogues are being developed for disorders such as irritable bowel syndrome, and there's certainly a GSK compound, so it's an active area of research for small intestinal and colonic motility. But one of the most striking posters I saw at the EASD was it was done, I think, in Dubai, but certainly type 2 patients who are Arabs, and giving rectal taurocolic acid and finding a profound lowering of blood glucose and profound stimulation of both GLP-1 and PYY by that technique. So, and certainly the analogues affect colonic and small intestinal motility, and effects on small intestinal motility is something we're looking at, do affect glucose absorption. So I hope I haven't added more confusion than clarity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Horowitz. Now I'd like to close this very comprehensive